My question is more, when you were head of policy planning, you did write a number of articles, you were engaging in speeches on democracy. What bearing does democracy have in globalism and nationalism, and what are your ideas on democracy?
You know, it's really a bad time for Americans to be lecturing anybody. And I think that's what I learned more at the State Department than anything else, that we just don't really have the credibility right now to lecture the rest of the world about democracy promotion, and not just with what's happened in Afghanistan in the last couple of days, which I wish I could do a separate session on that, but our commitments abroad, people question everywhere our commitments, and will we stick with them? And I think what it's been most, I think, positive for me about the tragedy in Afghanistan. I'm on some email chains with think tank leads in Washington, on both sides of the aisle, who have been either in Southwest Asia, who have served in government in either administration, and they're talking about not just the blame game, which I'm trying to stay away from because this is a 20-year bipartisan failure for the United States and the NATO countries, but the fact that we owe the Afghans who stood along with us safe harbor, and our credibility won't return soon if we don't figure out at least that part of it in addition to our own people. So that's a really positive development, because I don't think we've always had that particular conversation. But on your specific question about how did I talk as a diplomat about, I think, the promotion of Western values of a liberal international order, I tried not to do a lot of it because it just wasn't of deep interest to a lot of our partners abroad. What I did do that seemed to fascinate everyone, and I did it probably more so than anyone in the administration, and got myself in trouble because I'm a professor and I don't know these things. You just kind of do your own thing, and then, in government, like, there are all kinds of rules that academics aren't good at. But I talked about the Trump Doctrine, and I would outline what I thought the pillars were, and I would outline then why I thought each pillar was problematic. And I did that once at the Atlantic Council in Washington, for a meeting that was being chaired, I think, by Steve Hadley, the former National Security Advisor. I'm not sure if Madeleine Albright was there, but she's the co-chair. And Hadley, I heard later, talk to Mike Pompeo, who then called me into the office. I thought I was really going to get scolded. And he said that Hadley said, I saw Kiron did something I've never seen a government official do, which is say, here's what's wrong with everything we're doing. And I said, well, I'm director of policy planning. That's my job. And so I think that's what I did that was probably of most value, both to U.S. diplomats en route waiting for Senate confirmation and to our partners abroad, to say, this isn't as scary as you think it is. Here, let me outline what's going on, what America First and the Trump Doctrine mean. One, the national interest, as the nation state's it's the first and the core unit of analysis in the international system. International organizations do matter. No one in the administration that I've talked to has said they should all be blown up. Multilateralism still matters. I've not heard anyone say anything against it. But first among first is the nation state, for like obvious empirical reasons, not normative reasons, but for obvious reasons. You need political and economic borders, and sovereignty is part of that. That trade agreements and other types of agreements, including arms control, should be based on strict reciprocity. This is not a new idea. Nothing that I'm saying is new. Trump he's represented it to the public and the world, especially in his UN addresses. If you read them, he's outlining all of these things. He's at his best in those addresses, because he's not doing a rally, and he's kind of talking to the rest of the world, and he's really trying to be systematic, even though sometimes he slips back into that kind of campaign language that he loves. So it's the nation state, core unit of analysis. Agreements based on international agreements on reciprocity, greater burden sharing among allies and partners, like his whole discussion about NATO. And I see Denise Elson, I think, in the back. She had to sit through too many speeches where I talked about that part of the Trump Doctrine, the burden sharing in NATO. He talked about that so much in the 2016 campaign, and turned out he was right. When he was campaigning in 2016, of the 29 NATO members at that time, it's now 30, about 4 were paying living up to the 2% of GDP toward defense of the pledge that had been made years earlier. Now it's almost about 8 to 10, and billions upon billions of dollars of contributions have come in, partly due to, I think, the Trump era, not exclusively other factors. So burden sharing, and there were a host of other principles, but each one is contradictory. And I would talk about the contradictions. So if you say the nation state is the core unit of analysis, that means the national interest matters more for states than other things. What about when states have a different interest than your own? And how then do you come to agreement? You mean diplomacy now matters more. You have to work harder when you're asking states to care about their interests first. And so what's your diplomatic machine going to look like? You're asking for more work, not less. So I would go through, we want more burden sharing. That means that states that contribute this 2% pledge, they have more say. And we've been used to being the leader on mutual defense. So each one of these I would talk about, and I think that that was really important for calming people down. I felt that I was a mini therapist when I was in government. I have no qualifications to be a therapist. Everyone who knows me says I would be a terrible one. But I would calm people down by saying, this is just pulling out from a lot of Western liberal international order ideas that somehow in the last couple of decades under globalization got forgotten about, but that people actually believe. It was a kind of practical way of looking at international relations. And when we look back at the Trump years with more objectivity than we can right now, we were right in lockstep with the direction that the United States and the world have been going. We did pull out of TPP, we did pull out of the Paris Climate Accord, Human Rights Council, the UN, but we were as much of a multilateral actor as we had ever been. And I think we'll see a lot of stability aside from the noise. The noise was amazing. It was interesting. Sometimes I miss it, but it really didn't go in line with a lot of the actual things that we were doing. Other questions, or do I have more time for conversation? Okay. Okay. I have some other things I wanted to mention to you because there's a big discussion of the business sector in the readings that you did. And there is a growing realization, and I learned some things in the readings I didn't know. Our own Condoleezza Rice was part of a group with Tony Blair and others talking to and advising, I guess, Chase, and even the Biden transition team. I hope this doesn't fall on me or us. And I think I can. I'm used to doing stuff, but so they, and they were saying, and these are seen as kind of globalist elites, bipartisan, transnational elites, who were saying that the system that's in place isn't quite working for the world. If we don't take on inequality, we're not going to win. And I thought that was probably, of all the things that I read in our packet that I put together, I thought that was perhaps the most interesting. When you have those who've been the most committed in their careers to building up this kind of global international order that is now being challenged, and they're even saying, we didn't get it right, or it hasn't worked on issues of inequality in the world. I think that that's a pretty profound statement about the failures of globalization, that it didn't lift up people the way many thought it would 20 or 30 years ago. Too many billions of people got left behind, and too many countries of the global south are saying, this isn't working for us, we're going to look around for alternatives. And some of those alternatives, sadly, have unfortunate nationalist tendencies. as well. I just wanted to bring that into the conversation because I think at the end of the day, which side wins if there's a winning, nationalism or globalization? It's really about who can address issues of inequality. Donald Trump tried that in the 2016 campaign, and he talked a lot about the fact that the economy got better under him. More people of color, more women were working, were in the workforce, unemployment was lower. But if you look at what Biden is saying, he's saying some of the same things, but he's taking it to a different level. He's focusing on the underclass. And he's making himself this populist hero, not for just the middle class, but for those who are stuck in structural unemployment. And in that way, he sees himself, I think, what is it called, the new bargain, like the New Deal, as an FDR hero. And I think he's doing that because whether you're a globalist or a nationalist, and I think he's some combination of both, you don't win if you don't address what is the hardest problem. Do you have any reaction to that? Did that jump out at you in the readings at all? Anyone? I'm going to call on that young woman right there who's looking at me. I knew everyone would turn. So you can figure out who you are. Does anyone want to say from that group a response to what I've just said on that point?
Oh,
Yes.
I don't know. To me, it seems like very clear and like obvious and like a great call to arms of everyone should think that because it seems like a great way to build a coalition and to build allies and actually do the thing that you say you want to do by focusing on those groups of people. So that's why I was smiling, and maybe that's why you thought I had something interesting to say, but I did not.
Yeah. Anyone else on the issue of inequality who hasn't spoken? I'll come to you. Yes.
Yeah. Hello. My name is Steven, and I'm from Los Angeles. It's I found your talk so far really fascinating, the discussion that's come out of it. But one question I guess to sort of have is, how do you see like even this solution that you're sort of proposing address the core issues or dilemmas that drive a lot of people who are involved in this debate with globalism and nationalism, which is this suggested contradiction within the inherent liberal system itself, which has more to do, because I talk to a lot of populists, for example, and interestingly, never once is it as much per se an argument about what the market. Yeah, well, sure, it's by the secondary issue by what the market can or cannot do, but it's how the market can be shifted to the extent that it's able to preserve core cultural norms that people in the nation state seek to preserve, which the efficient allocation of market resources has been insufficient to address, for example. Like this idea that, like, for example, and this I think is concerning, but some populists who I know who would refer to America as not an idea, but a people specifically, that there are certain cultural norms, right, which the nation is supposed to preserve, and the nation is a means towards that end, and all economic allocation should be addressed towards that preservation. So how would you, I guess, suggest addressing some of those core cultural concerns that a lot of these nationalists have to begin with, which stem from the fact that many nationalists argue that liberalism inherently and globalism inherently corrodes the cultural connections that drive many of these people sort of up the wall. Just what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that's difficult. Let me state a little bit differently what I think you're saying, and that is many quote-unquote populist or nationalist believe that the free market is being manipulated against them. Is that what you're saying? Or that the free market doesn't work?
Sure, it's the free market, or intrinsically liberalism, it's an inherent facet of liberalism to corrode the cultural connections and identitarian ligaments, right, so to speak, which hold the nation state together, or the community, right, as imprinted on the nation state.
My response to that is that in the post-1945 world, there was a sense that the liberal international order that we helped create, it really goes back to the Atlantic Charter in 1941, before we even entered World War II, when FDR and Churchill met and basically mapped out the post-war political economy for the world, that we never stopped to really question it and rival hypothesize as much as I think people are doing now. And that rival hypothesizing is coming from odd corners, and corners in which liberal elites often don't think people have a viewpoint. They think they aren't well educated. They don't know what they're talking about. I think that's actually not true. I don't think they have all of the concepts worked out. They haven't, read all the literature, but they have some instincts that need to be turned into hypotheses. And that's what helped Donald Trump in 2016, is that he went into those 30-odd flyover states that were being ignored and talked to people about these very issues. It was really fascinating to see that they had foreign policy ideas. They had ideas about organizing the global economy. They weren't, and this was happening at rallies and in town halls. And while Hillary Clinton was at University of Pittsburgh and places like that giving rallies, Trump was in Moon Township having these kinds of conversations. I think that's something that we have a responsibility as scholars and public servants to do a better job at. That everything is up for contest, even when we think we have the settled idea about the way the world should be organized and what it should look like. So I like the comment that you made. I wanted to, before we end, talk about what I think is a dangerous effect of American nationalism right now, and that it is bipartisan. And it's been striking to me in the Biden administration, less than a year old, that I can make that case that it's bipartisan. It's making China the boogeyman for the problems in our own economy. And it's creating a kind of, I think, toxic nationalism that's not going to ultimately deliver for people. That if we can just take on China in terms of trade, that our economy will somehow magically be better. I don't think it's going to work, and I think it brings up in people and in some pockets of the country a kind of anti-Asian sentiment that's not exactly consistent with where our country is. And so we see a lot of talk about China. I'm trying not to do that on television. I got myself all twisted up at the State Department for some things I said about China that really came out all wrong, and spent, President Xi denounced me and others, and, I just thought, I'm not really that important. Like, don't waste your time. There are other things you could be doing against us. But I think that that's something that we really have to look at, is this whole approach that China is the problem, that it's just because it has benefited through its WTO status when it really wasn't a developing nation, that it's led the world on a dangerous course. There are other things I'd like to say that I think are also a problem for nationalism. This idea of reshoring jobs and manufacturing. The mechanisms for that aren't as easy as many of the economic nationalists are promising. It does hurt companies to just begin reshoring jobs. Sometimes it's worse, and sometimes they just can't sustain the kind of production that they need. And those are things that I'm looking at closely in my part of the country, in Pennsylvania. And so I could say a lot more, but I think I'm on time. I'm happy to keep talking to you after this session. And I thank you so much for being here and taking part in this really important course that Hoover is offering. Thank you.